This episode is brought to you by Netflix. So Netflix is basically Santa this year. 2 NFL games on Christmas Day, streaming live. At 1 p.m. Eastern, it's Cowboys, Commanders. Then at 4:30, you've got Lions, Vikings. Midwest football, playoff stakes, and probably some snow. Watching holiday football is a tradition the whole family can enjoy. Open some gifts, grab some food, settle in, and watch NFL Live on Netflix this Christmas Day.
What if an appliance emergency didn't have to be? If your appliances suddenly decided they were done, don't stress. Best Buy has you covered with a wide variety of major appliances from trusted brands, in stock and available now. So you don't have to worry about laundry piling up, refilling the fridge, or that big dinner party you're hosting. Because Best Buy has the knowledge and expertise to get you the right appliance for your home. Learn more at bestbuy.com. Best Buy. Imagine that.
Support for Ben Franklin's World comes from the Omohundro Institute of Early American History and Culture, proud citizens of vast early America, and the primary partners in the Georgian Papers program. The Georgian Papers program aims to digitize, interpret, and make available an extraordinarily rich collection of correspondence, maps, and royal household ledgers created by the Georgian kings of England and their families. This program is huge because it seeks to make available approximately 350,000 items to the world. Digital access to this collection promises to really change our understanding of the Georgian period and of 18th and early 19th century North America. As part of its contribution to this program, the Omohundro Institute is sending scholars to Windsor Castle to work alongside royal archivists as they seek to gain greater insight into these rich materials. And these scholars can't believe the materials they're looking at. For example, Jim Ambuska, who recently earned his PhD in history from the University of Virginia, and who, thanks to the Omohundro Institute, spent some time at Windsor Castle, noted that as a historian of Revolutionary America, he never expected that he would one day have access to King George III's original letters, those of his family, and the papers of his most trusted ministers. And now, you can have access to these papers too, because these are part of the rich materials that the Georgian Papers program is digitizing. For more information about the Georgian Papers program and the Omohundro Institute's support of it, visit benfranklinsworld.com/Georgian Papers.
Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 139 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. Remember that line from the Columbus Day poem we learned in grade school? In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. The poem goes on to tell us all about Christopher Columbus's voyage and where he sailed. But what it omits is that Columbus also played a central role in the European adoption of Indian or Native American slavery. Now, Indian and Native American slavery isn't something we often think about when we think of slavery in early America. And that's because in our minds, slavery in early America means a system of African and African American chattel slavery. But that wasn't the only system of slavery that existed in early North America. Systems of Indian slavery existed too. In fact, Indians remained enslaved long after the 13th Amendment abolished chattel slavery in 1865. Today, we're going to investigate this other form of American slavery. Our guide is Andres Resendez, a professor of history at my graduate alma mater of UC Davis, and the author of The Other Slavery, the uncovered story of Indian enslavement in America. Now, during our investigation, Andres reveals how and when the practice of Indian slavery started, details about Indian slavery and the role it played in the Mexican Silver Rush and in the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, and what happened when Indian slavery became a United States institution after the Mexican-American War in 1848. But first, I set the dates for the Philadelphia and Anaheim meetups. The Philadelphia meetup will take place on Saturday, July 22nd at 4:30 p.m., and the Anaheim meetup will take place on Tuesday, August 22nd. I still need to figure out where we'll be meeting, and in the case of Anaheim, when we'll be meeting, which is why you should join the Ben Franklin's World listener community on Facebook, or send me an email if you'd like to participate. This way, I can keep you apprised of plans, and you can help me make those plans. My email is liz@benfranklinsworld.com, Or to join the listener community, all you need to do is text BF World to 33444 or visit benfranklinsworld.com and click on the orange Join Now button on the home screen, and that'll get you access to that community. All right, are you ready to venture forth on our exploration of the other slavery? Without further ado, let's go meet our expert guide.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Joining us is a professor of history at the University of California, Davis. He's a specialist in the histories of colonial Latin America, North American borderlands, and the Iberian world. He's the author of 3 books, including A Land So Strange, The Epic Journey of Cabeza de Vaca, and today, he joins us to discuss details from his most recent book, which was a finalist for the National Book Award and the winner of the 2017 Bancroft Prize, The Other Slavery, The Uncovered Story of Indian Enslavement in America. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Andres Resendez.
Thank you so much. It is a pleasure to be here.
In his book, The Other Slavery, Andres challenges our idea that slavery in North America encompassed Africans and African Americans alone. And he does this by exploring the story of Indian enslavement in North America. Andres, would you provide us with an overview of Indian slavery? When did the practice begin and where was it practiced?
Sure. This is something that not only myself, but many other scholars have been writing about for a number of years. But the literature has really blossomed, especially in the last 2 decades, especially in the 21st century. So Native Americans had practices of captivity and enslavement prior to the European context. This is not something that the Europeans brought along to the New World. But what did happen with the arrival of Europeans was that these practices that were originally embedded in clear cultural context became commodified and expanded in unexpected ways and eventually came to resemble the kinds of practices that we have come to identify now as human trafficking and modern-day forms of enslavement. So by these embedded forms of captivity and enslavement, I mean things like, for example, in Mesoamerica, as is well known, peoples like Mayas, Olmecs, Aztecs, for example, procured captives for the purpose of human sacrifice and ritual cannibalism. So that's one area in which these practices existed, and they were in some ways different from what Europeans would have conceived as slavery, but in other ways they were close enough so that Europeans relied on these pre-existing practices and folded them in what they understood as slavery. There are many other examples all over the Americas about these culturally embedded practices of captivity and enslavement. In the Pacific Northwest, for example, to finalize elite marriages, sometimes captives were provided as a sort of a dowry. Mourning wars amongst the Iroquois people are well known and studied. So there are many examples like that.
It sounds like Indian slavery or practices of it predated the arrival of Europeans. So how did Europeans get the idea that they should also adopt and practice forms of Indian slavery?
Well, Europeans, especially Mediterranean Europeans, had a long-standing practice of enslavement. So prior to getting to the New World, peoples in the Iberian Peninsula, for example, or in the Italian Peninsula, held slaves, whether from Africa or from the Eastern Mediterranean, from the Levant, or sometimes from the islands of the coast of Africa. For example, Canary Islanders were introduced into Iberian households. So the possibility of enslaving Native Americans was not something that was foreign to them. It was, in fact, something that they had practiced for a long time. It was also something that had bolstered colonization and imperial aims of Europeans in other parts of the world. So Columbus himself, prior to going to the New World, had actually visited São Jorge da Mina, which was the main Portuguese trading hub in what is now the coast of Ghana, and had witnessed firsthand how the trade of gold and other commodities, as well as humans, could become a viable colonial outpost in a remote land.
We sometimes hear and read about colonial New Englanders, New Yorkers, and South Carolinians as practicing Indian slavery, and then they gave it all up so that they could practice African slavery. Was the colonial European practice of Indian slavery simply a temporary measure before these colonists could import African slaves?
Yes, one of the reasons why I got involved in this subject is because I initially subscribed to this notion that Indian slavery, it is well known that it happened, but the question is how prevalent was that and how important was that and when did it happen? And the standard story was that this is something that happened early on, but then indigenous populations went into a deep decline as Africans became available in larger numbers, or also salaried workers became available. And so this was pretty much a marginal phenomenon that may have occurred early on in the colonial period, but it then subsequently became quite minor. Instead, what I found was that these practices certainly predated African slavery in the New World and continued to occur alongside African slavery and salaried work all through the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. And because, I try to explain in the book, because these forms of enslavement were multifarious and were not supposed to occur, there was no major civil war and major 13th Amendment or major abolition of these form of enslavement. So in many ways, it actually went on even after African slavery was abolished.
So one of the things that struck me when I read The Other Slavery was Christopher Columbus's involvement with the European enslavement of Indians. Andres, would you tell us about the role Christopher Columbus played in the European adoption of Indian slavery?
It is very interesting because, as I had mentioned earlier, he had a clear model in mind because he had journeyed alongside Portuguese navigators for many years before going to the New World. He also believed that this was a possibility for economic development, at least initially. So, of course, Columbus's hope was to reach the Orient, and instead he stumbled upon this unknown continent. And he did find some gold, but he certainly didn't find any precious spices or Chinese silks or any of the goods that he thought would actually make his venture profitable. And so in the absence of these great commodities, he offered to the Spanish monarchs, his sponsors, the possibility of sending slaves in, and he actually wrote very candid letters about that, saying how Indian slaves were so much better than the slaves that were being procured from Guinea. He was also very candid about the fact that there were so numerous that they could send many adult males, an infinite number of women, and so on. And he, in part to recoup some of the costs of the expeditions, the first two expeditions at least, he actually started sending slaves back to Spain, something that eventually caused friction between himself and the Spanish monarchs, who at first were agnostic about the possibility of admitting Native American slaves in Europe, but eventually they came down against that possibility. They became persuaded that that was not completely legal activity in the same way that African slavery was legal or the enslavement of other peoples from the Eastern Mediterranean was legal.
Would you tell us more about Columbus's economic motivations for participating in Indian slavery?
Well, I mean, he was, as I tried to explain in the book, not only a great navigator and discoverer, but he was also a businessman. He had made a living by accompanying people who knew how to buy cheap and sell dear. And he was a hard-nosed businessman. And we can see that in the various agreements that he struck with various European courts as he pitched his project of going east by sailing west. And he pitched that to, for example, Portugal before, and he eventually pitched that to the Spanish monarchy, which took him up on that. But in the so-called capitulations that he signed with the Spanish crown, you can see that he was covering all his economic bases, meaning that he would get a substantial percentage of the share of the trade that he anticipated would occur between Spain and the Orient once he established that regular maritime route to the Orient. The wording of the capitulations also was very general, and so it included other marketable commodities, etc., and so that included human beings, and so that was the part of his agreement that he wanted to address when he started sending Native Americans to Europe.
As you just mentioned, Columbus sent Native Americans to Spain to be sold as slaves. And I wonder if you would tell us what the Native Americans' passage to Spain was like and what their new lives in Europe were like.
So these Native Americans were from the areas, of course, that Spaniards colonized. So initially they were from the Caribbean, then they came to include coastal areas of what is now Mexico, the coast of Colombia, the coast of Venezuela, Florida, and so on. So this is where they came from. It is also interesting that many of them were children and women. So contrary to the image that we have of African enslavement, that was very much in line with the practices of European households, having slaves from the wider Mediterranean world or having Africans, etc. So the majority actually were women, African slaves in the Iberian Peninsula and in Italy, which were the two leading regions holding slaves. And that was also the case from Eastern Europeans being held in these two parts of the Mediterranean. So in that way, the enslavement of Native Americans, the gender and age breakdown was pretty typical because they were meant as domestic help, as domestic servants or as domestic slaves. We have extremely good records about these Native Americans who were held in the first half of the 16th century in Spain because eventually the Spanish crown in 1542 outlawed the taking of Indian slaves regardless of the reasons. So before that, it had been generally illegal except for a few loopholes, but those loopholes proved to be very wide, and so many people were actually sent to Europe, but those loopholes were closed after 1542. And moreover, those European holders who kept their slaves were required to come forward and show the titles that they have, and they had to be reviewed by lawyers and then determine whether these Indians were held legally or not, and if not, they would be immediately set free. And so what we have is a number of judicial proceedings, some of them running 200, 300, 400, 500 pages of Indians suing their masters for their freedom. And these sources really allow us quite a bit of insight into their lives. And so their lives is what you would expect. They were brought as children, many of them, or women, as I said. They often were secondary wives or concubines in the case of women. In the case of children, they were often put to work in domestic activities involving the running of the household or raising of children. In some cases, they were also trained in certain trades. So, for example, many of them were weavers. We find some weavers. And their life was almost claustrophobic, meaning their life really revolved around the house. Sometimes, especially these Indian slaves who had trades, were sublet or rented out for small periods to other households. So they move around from place to place. And so that's sort of the picture that we get from these cases that we have.
Andres, you've just painted a picture of slavery that's really different from the one that many of us have. I mean, for many of us, our picture of slavery consists of Africans and African Americans working on plantations, either in the Caribbean or on the mainlands of North and South America. But your description shows that American slavery also consisted of enslaved Native Americans living and working in Europe.
That's right. And as I said in the book, it's a remarkable thought, first of all, in that it kind of constitutes a reverse middle passage, as I call it, from the Americas to Europe, as opposed to from Africa to the New World. It also is very similar in that mortality rates were very high. There was overcrowding in these ships. Mortality rates were very high. And the main difference, as already implied by all of my answers, is that whereas many of the African slaves were adult males, the majority of them were, in the case of Native Americans, the majority were women and children.
You noted that many women and children were sent to Spain to serve as domestic servants or to learn a trade such as weaving. Did colonists use Indian slaves differently in North America?
So North America was a very different story in that, in the case of the Iberian Peninsula, Indian slaves were constituted a minority of the workforce. They were something of a novelty. There were a few communities where they were quite common, but overall, this is a very small percentage of the overall workforce in Europe. In the New World, however, native labor was the bedrock of most of the enterprises, certainly all of the very early enterprises. So you can find them in ranches, you can find them in mining developments, you can find them building houses, you can find them as domestic servants. So you can find them in all kinds of activities in the New World. And that is one of the reasons why the trajectories of Indian slavery diverge so starkly between the Iberian Peninsula and the New World. As I mentioned, the Spanish crown abolished Indian slavery in 1542. and that led to a decline of the institution in the Iberian Peninsula. So the number of Indians imported into the Iberian Peninsula went down through the second half of the 16th century and became fairly rare. There are some cases, but rare in the 17th century until it disappeared nearly completely. In the New World, that was not the case because everything depended on Indian labor. And so owners strenuously opposed this liberation of Indian slaves. We have incredible letters from the highest authorities in the New World to the Spanish king asking him to reconsider this order. And eventually the Spanish king insisted. But what happened was then that because everything depended on coerced Indian labor, which had been the norm for 50 years by then, the next solution was to try to find subterfuges and euphemisms to get around this prohibition while maintaining control over Indian slaves.
Did the Spanish living in North America ever look to African slavery to replace Indian slavery? You know, the way that the Dutch, English, French, and Portuguese did?
All of these powers that you mentioned participated in both African slavery and Indian slavery. So Spain was no different from those. So very early on, for example, when Indians started dying off in the Caribbean, Spain subcontracted the transportation of Africans to the Caribbean very early on. So yes, Spain looked into these possibilities. However, Spain had a couple of problems. One of them is that Spain itself did not have possessions in Western Africa that it could use as a launching off point to bring African slaves. So it essentially had to subcontract its African slaves from the neighboring Iberian kingdom of Portugal. So that was one problem. And the other one, of course, is that there were immediately very significant price differentials. So African slaves had to be imported from halfway around the world and subcontracted with a different monarchy. And therefore, they were very expensive by the time they got to the New World. In contrast, Indian slaves were a lot cheaper. And by that, I mean, like, for example, in the 17th century, you could get 3 or sometimes 4 Native Americans for the price of 1 African slave. So the price differentials were very significant.
Earlier, you noted that the North American colonists disliked the Spanish Crown's 1542 order to abolish slavery, because for 50 years, the colonists had relied on the labor of Indian slaves. And I wonder if we could talk about the ways that the colonists relied on Indian labor. Would you tell us about the Spanish silver rush in Mexico, which took place between the 16th and 19th centuries, and the role that enslaved Indian labor played in that rush?
Mining was probably the principal, quote-unquote, employment of Indian slaves. And it is easy to lose sight of the scope of these silver rush. And to do that, I tried to provide some comparative data in the book. So, for example, I note that the California gold rush lasted about 20 years. The geographic area where it unfolded was fairly restricted to a certain quadrant of what is now the state of California, although there were some other strikes elsewhere in North America, of course. And, it produced a certain level of gold, resulting in about 300,000 people decamping to California. And I compare that to what went on in this earlier silver rush, which essentially started in the 1520s and it plateaued in the 17th century, but it gained a second wind in the 18th century. So by the second half of the 18th century, it reached the high watermark levels at a time when Mexico had become the leading producer of silver in the world. And often over half, in many of those years, in the second half of the 18th century, over half of all the silver produced in the world came from the various mines in Mexico. I also calculated the total output of silver in kilograms and compared that to the output of gold in California in the 19th century and concluded that it's 12 times as much silver was produced in this earlier silver rush running through the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. And finally, in terms of the geography, and I offer a map to show this based on the most complete inventory of silver strikes that we have, it essentially covered much of what is now Mexico. This silver rush started in what is now central and southern Mexico, and it eventually expanded through the western slopes along the Pacific. Then it moved into the high plateau where some of the richest mines like Guanajuato and Zacatecas were found. And eventually it got practically all the way to what is now the American Southwest, so a little shy of that. and from the Pacific all the way to practically the Atlantic. So the geographic distribution of these mines was mind-boggling. So Mexico never had a mountain of silver like Potosí, as it happened in South America, which was the other main producer of silver, but it had a variety of silver mines which contributed to a greater or lesser extent to this overall volume. And it's also important to bear in mind that extracting all that silver was extremely laborious because unlike the gold placers, which require some superficial digging, in the case of silver, you actually had to follow the veins, the silver veins, which usually led way down. And so, in fact, some of these mines ended up producing some of the deepest man-made shafts in the world. Then you have to bring the ore up. You have to crush that to a powder. You have to mix that with fairly dangerous reactives like mercury in order to get the mercury to amalgamate to the silver and sink to the bottom. And then finally boil that to leave the pure silver. So all of that required untold amounts of labor at a time when the Spanish crown prohibited anyone from outside the Spanish Empire to come to work in these mines. And so if California attracted 300,000, these mines ended up producing 12 times as much metal that was more difficult, more labor-intensive to produce, and it could only be extracted by A, Indian labor, B, African slave labor, and C, there are even some Asian laborers that were brought all the way from Spain, had an outpost in the Philippines, and some of them were brought even from the Indian subcontinent. So that gives you a sense of the incredible pool of these silver mines.
The demand for labor at these silver mines was so great that it had implications for regions like New Mexico. Andres, would you tell us about the Spanish conquest of New Mexico and the role that the Mexican silver rush played in this conquest?
Absolutely. So oftentimes the history of the colonization of New Mexico is explained on the basis of conversion of Indians to the Catholic religion. It makes really little sense. It really makes more sense when you realize that New Mexico was initially visited by slave raiders who were looking for warm bodies to take to the silver mines that were being developed further south from New Mexico. So there were some early expeditions in the 1580s, for example, before New Mexico was finally colonized by Spain, from these outside raiders coming into New Mexico. They had a very clear sense that New Mexico's demography was very conducive to the procurement of laborers because New Mexico had these 70 or more settled pueblos, as they became known, Pueblo Indians, meaning they were settled towns, superficially making them a little similar to what existed in central Mexico. And they were surrounded by nomadic groups like Apaches and Navajos who could also be subject to enslavement. And so eventually the families that did organize the colonization of New Mexico were intimately tied to the silver economy of Mexico. And that's a very good explanation of why New Mexico became colonized. The mines that developed further south from New Mexico, especially there's one very important mine called Parral in what is now southern Chihuahua. That very much structured life in New Mexico. So New Mexico, they didn't find at the time any silver or other precious metals in New Mexico. But New Mexico became quickly a supplier to Parral and to some other silver districts further south. And so it was either producing goods for the mines on the basis of course labor in New Mexico. So that was one way to do that. So meritorious Spanish colonizers were given encomiendas, which were grants of Indians in perpetuity, that they were distinguished from slavery in that they could not be sold, but these Indians owed either labor or goods to their overlord, to the Spanish overlord. So that was one way in which these mines were supplied. Or the other way was simply to take Indians from New Mexico and take them to the mines to be sold there. So that was increasingly the tie between New Mexico and the mines further south.
It's really interesting to consider that there was more to the Spanish colonization of New Mexico and parts of the American Southwest and even the Pacific Coast than religion. Because if we think about Spanish settlement in those regions, many of us probably think about the Spanish mission system, which was one method the Spanish used to colonize. Andres, did the Spanish mission system have anything to do with Indian slavery?
To be sure, there was a lot of coercion in the missions. So initially, of course, missionaries were sometimes the vanguard of European exploration. Sometimes they established contact with indigenous groups first. Initially, maybe there had been a voluntary agreement to settle in the missions, in part because the missions offered some refuge against other possibilities. As I mentioned, there were Spanish slavers also operating, so the mission offered a less threatening environment to some, especially smaller groups. Big, powerful groups often did not want missions within them. I mean, I'm thinking about Apaches, Navajos, etc. They did not consent missionaries to come into their territories. But I think what happened is that after that initial period of missions, then it became clear that the missions were not the best way to control indigenous peoples. And this is, we're maybe getting ahead of our story, but especially in the 18th century, the Spanish crown, in order to protect the silver districts, decided that it could no longer just rely on missions trying to persuade the Indians to become upstanding Christians, but instead it had to rely on the military. And so basically the Spanish crown militarized these frontier areas. And then these presidios, or military garrisons, clearly coercion and slavery were far more prevalent. In fact, there are orders to these presidios not to enslave Indians or to sell Indians to the silver owners and so on. So we know that these activities went on in these presidios.
What did this all mean for the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, which is perhaps the most famous event we know of when we think about early New Mexico? Many scholars have said that religion caused this revolt, but was Indian slavery the actual cause?
Right. In the book, I have a whole chapter about the Pueblo Revolt, and I do not deny that religion played a role. I mean, it is hard not to realize that religion played a role because missionaries were especially tortured and slain by the Pueblo rebels. Maybe 2/3 of the missionaries died during the Pueblo Revolt. It was also clear, if you look at the damage made by the rebels, that they targeted churches and missions, defaced images, defecated on altars. Clearly, there was this religious component to it. But at the same time, I tried to make the case that the enslavement of natives was another very powerful reason for this uprising to occur. And the way I try to show this is, first of all, we have some testimonies of some of the native rebels to the effect that they wanted their relatives, and sometimes wives, daughters, brothers, sisters, etc., to be returned. So we have those testimonies. There are only a handful of testimonies because the revolt, as you know, was a secret rebellion, basically. It erupted somewhat unexpectedly, and it succeeded so well that it essentially drove the entire Spanish population out of New Mexico for a period of 12 years. So the testimonies are few, but they are very clear about this. A second very interesting observation that I make is that New Mexico is very special in that before all of these Spanish and their dependents left New Mexico, they actually passed a muster. And there you can really get an in-depth view of who these people were. And what you find is that many of them are just children. I mean, just the youth that existed in the thousands of people living in New Mexico, many of them were children. Many of them were dependent on various residents. And what's really interesting is that, of course, you find that very prominent New Mexican heads of households own dozens of servants, Indian servants, as well as some African slaves. So that's not surprising. But what's really interesting is that even ordinary New Mexicans had Indian slaves. So, for example, I remember very vividly there was a woman, a widow, who had 2 daughters, and she also declared 2 Indian servants. And the muster taker thought that she was so poor that he actually reported that she had no shoes, and yet she had these 2 Indian servants. New Mexico was famous for being a place in which convicts were sent to serve out their sentences. So again, one of those were surveyed this time, and he also declared 1 or 2 Indian servants. I can't recall exactly. But the point is that it's not only the wealthy families, but many New Mexicans, even very ordinary, even very poor New Mexicans, had Indian servants of their own. So it was a very servant-heavy society, which is very clear in these musters as all of these people are leaving New Mexico. And the third point that I make in the book is that if you plot the area of the rebellion, and it is called the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, but in fact many other indigenous peoples participated in that revolt as well. indigenous peoples in what is now the state of Sonora in Mexico, indigenous peoples in what is now the state of Chihuahua in Mexico were also participants, to the point where some scholars actually talk about the Great Northern Rebellion or the Great Southwestern Rebellion rather than the Pueblo Revolt. So if you compare that larger area that revolted and you plot that against what I call the corridors of enslavement leading from New Mexico to this particular mine in Parral that I talk about, you see that there is quite a bit of overlap. So clearly the Indians who chose to participate in these uprisings match very well with the areas in which Spaniards were slaving with the view of sending those slaves to the mine of Parral.
As we've heard throughout this conversation, Indian slavery proved to be an adaptable institution. Even after the Spanish outlawed the practice, so many colonists owned slaves that the institution persisted into the 19th century and likely even into the 20th century, which means Indian slavery eventually became a United States problem and institution. Andres, would you tell us when Indian slavery became an American problem and how the institution had evolved so much that many Americans didn't initially recognize it as a form of slavery?
Indian slavery had existed all along throughout the Americas, as I note in the book. It had existed also in the English colonies. It had existed in the Carolinas, as the work of Alain Gallet makes very clear. It had existed in New France, as the work of Brett Rushforth has made very clear. It had existed in Florida, as various works have made it clear. But interestingly enough, in the course of the 18th century in particular, and certainly by the early decades of the 19th century, Indian slavery in that region was superseded and certainly eclipsed by African slavery. So while it existed in some forms in some of these regions, it had been largely eclipsed by this other form of enslavement. In the West, however, that did not happen. So places like New Mexico, California, Utah, etc., Indian slavery remained a very active institution in the 19th century. And so when Mexico and the United States went to war and the United States emerged victorious and claimed this enormous territorial whole, then it became, once again, as it had been, an American problem. And you see that in the letters of many of these westbound Americans going to places like Utah or California or New Mexico, where they come in contact with this other form of coercion. And sometimes they liken it to African slavery. So some of these are Southerners who have clear experience with the other peculiar institution. And then they say, well, this is just identical or very similar or the equivalent of African slavery in the South. Others make other distinctions, but clearly they recognize these set of labor practices in the West for what they are, which is a form of extracting, exploiting human beings of a different race, using violence or the threat of violence, and preventing them from leaving the workplace and paying them either nothing or something so small as to be symbolic.
So how and when did the other slavery actually come to an end in North America?
There was no civil war to end Indian slavery. As I mentioned in the book, it was extremely difficult to stamp out. First of all, because it was not a singular institution, but it was a set of related practices. Second of all, because these practices were so adaptive, as you noted, and they changed depending on the legal framework, the legal context. And so the Spanish Crown tried to end it in 1542. It didn't work. The Spanish Crown actually went on these anti-Indian slavery campaign in the late 17th century, which made some temporary headway, but it did not end Indian slavery, certainly. Mexico, independent Mexico in the early 19th century, tried to eliminate Indian slavery, outlawed Indian slavery, and granting citizenship rights to Native American natives who had been born in Mexico's territory, but that didn't end the practice, as many states introduced servitude clauses in their state constitutions. And it was certainly another possibility arose in the aftermath of the Civil War with the 13th Amendment that contemplated the abolition of slavery and involuntary servitude, which opened the possibility for the abolition of these forms of enslavement that existed in the West. But that also didn't work out because increasingly the Supreme Court interpreted the 13th and the 14th Amendments as pertaining to African Americans rather than Native Americans. So it went into decline, but in some remote regions it continued through the end of the 19th century, and in some remote regions even well into the 20th century. And, I want to end the story in the United States, but of course Indian slavery continued in many other parts of the Americas, and there was in fact an upsurge of Indian slavery in the 20th century, for example, in Mexico, because of the export-led boom that occurred at that time in Mexico, leading to, again, an upsurge of these type of coercive labor arrangements.
Before we move into the time warp, would you talk to us about how you researched Indian slavery? We know from speaking with other scholars about African slavery that researching slaves and their lives is a really difficult task, given that slaves didn't typically leave behind much in the way of written records, and most of the sources that we do have actually come from the voices of slaveholders. So, would you tell us how you researched the other slavery and about the sources you used?
That's a great question. Indian slavery is actually very difficult to research, as you note. More difficult, for example, than African slavery, because at least with African slavery, it was a legal activity and they were brought in from another continent. So they had to cross an ocean. And therefore, we have port records about them. So it's easier to quantify them. And because they exist in wills and bills of sale, etc., it's a little easier to document their lives. In the case of Indian slavery, it was outlawed early on, at least in the case of the Spanish Empire, and therefore they essentially went underground. The practices were clandestine, and so people were disinclined to write openly about them or put them in official documents like wills, bills of sale, etc., etc. Nonetheless, we do have a continuous paper trail about the existence of these types of labor arrangements in all parts of the New World, from the 15th century all the way through the 19th century. And so while we sometimes cannot say exactly how many there were or exactly who they were, we do have assorted letters, we have official investigations, anti-slavery campaigns, we have, as I said, a continuous paper trail that one can access as a historian to try to document the lives of these people. And occasionally you have the really great resources. So at the beginning of the talk, I was talking about the judicial proceedings in Spain in the 16th century that are incredible sources. And we have some other judicial proceedings involving Indian slaves in the 17th century. So there are sources like that that can help us flesh out these lives. Also, an aspect that we almost didn't touch on is that Indian slavery is not something that Europeans did to Indians only. Some Indians enslave other Indians. And so we also have eyewitness accounts of European visitors going to these Indian nations and documenting the existence of these Indian slaves there. So it requires some detective work, but it is possible to gain a sense of when this activity is happening, where it is happening, and to say a little bit about the scale of these activities.
Systems of Indian slavery were really complex, and as we just heard, they take a lot of time to research and understand. We know if we take the time to understand African slavery as an institution, why it came to be, and how it developed, that we can better understand how the United States developed and why it still faces race-related problems today. So, Andres, what do you think the other slavery, Indian slavery, can teach us about our present-day world?
Well, what I write in the book is that in some ways, Indian slavery is the most direct precedent of the types of human trafficking that goes on today, in the sense that today, slavery is outlawed all over the world, and yet it exists. It exists because it poses as legitimate work, because it hinges on people serving out their sentences. It hinges on debts, for example. So it hinges on the types of institutions that would be very familiar to Native Americans of the 18th, 17th, or even 19th centuries. And so I try to think about what lessons we can draw from the 400-year experience of Native Americans with this other slavery, and what lessons can we draw for the types of human trafficking that exists today.
Okay, let's jump into the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently, or if someone had acted differently.
The time warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
In your opinion, what might have happened if Columbus had not negotiated the capitulations of Santa Fe in 1492? Would Indian slavery have developed if Columbus had not been economically motivated to begin the practice?
I think so. I think Columbus was an early practitioner, but it is remarkable that eventually all European powers came to practice this form of enslavement. And so it is something that was just second nature to European colonists. And so it would have developed regardless of Columbus or not.
Andres, now that you've recovered the history of Indian slavery, what are you researching now?
Well, this was such a difficult to research book and such a gloomy story that I'm trying to move to a different topic. I will continue to work on articles related to the other slavery, etc. But for a next book, I am now looking at the Pacific world, at the very early Pacific world, and the tremendous difficulties of learning to go from the Americas to Asia and come back. And that is a really interesting story of technological innovation, of incredible personalities, and wish to tap into the great riches of the Orient.
Do you have a website or a way we can contact you if we have questions?
I do have a website. You can find me at the University of California, Davis, the History Department website, or you can send me an email directly. And my email is aresendez@ucdavis.edu.
Andres Resendez, thank you so much for joining us and for taking us through the history of the other slavery.
Thank you so much for having me.
Indian slavery wasn't a temporary measure before the introduction of African slavery. It was a long-time practice that began before Europeans arrived in the Americas and one that continued into the 20th century. Now, like Native Americans, Europeans had a long-standing practice of slavery, especially those Europeans who lived in Mediterranean countries like Spain. Between this tradition, which Christopher Columbus knew and understood, and Columbus's voyage to the Portuguese slave trading post Elmina in Ghana, Columbus had a clear model of slavery in mind when he encountered Indians. As Andres revealed, Columbus was a savvy businessman and a tough negotiator. He stood to make a lot of money by enslaving Native Americans and sending them back to Spain. In fact, without spices and silks to trade, a trade in Indian slaves proved to be one of the few lucrative trading opportunities open to Columbus. Now, the practice of Indian slavery that Europeans adopted looked different in Europe than it did in the Americas. Europeans preferred to enslave Indian women and children, who could work inside their homes and shops as domestic servants and tradesmen. In America, colonists preferred to enslave Indian men because they thought men better suited for the heavy work required by farming, ranching, and silver mining. Now, although the Spanish passed laws to outlaw Indian enslavement as early as in 1542, the practice persisted into the 20th century. Because, as Andres noted, Indian labor formed the bedrock of the American labor force. Everyone felt they needed Indian slaves, so rather than give up the institution, they took it underground. Slaveholders changed how they talked about their slaves. They weren't slaves, they were debtors and peons. They also used loopholes in abolition laws to evade freeing their slaves. It's Indian slavery, more than any other form of slavery, that stands as the closest and most direct precedent for the slavery and human trafficking that exists today. And this is why Andres thinks it's important that we take the time to understand how this early American practice took root, evolved, and came to an end. For more information about Andres, his book, The Other Slavery, and for notes for this episode, visit the show notes page, benfranklinsworld.com/139. Support for today's episode came from the Omohundro Institute of Early American History and Culture. The Omohundro Institute supports the study and promotion of early American historical scholarship in a lot of different ways, including by serving as the primary partner in the Georgian Papers program. To learn more about the Omohundro Institute and the work it's doing to help digitize and interpret more than 350,000 items within the Georgian King's papers, visit benfranklinsworld.com/Georgian Papers. Now, our exploration of vast early America took us pretty early and pretty far west this week. What else about these early days of early American history would you like to know about? Send your answers to liz@benfranklinsworld.com, tweet me @LizCovart, or post a comment in our listener community on Facebook.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.
Are you interested in the parts of history that remain a mystery? Do you want to learn more about the historical myths and misconceptions used to prop up false belief today? I'm Nathaniel Lloyd, In my podcast, Historical Blindness, I delve into all of these topics, sharing puzzling tales from the past and examining hoaxes, conspiracy theories, and misremembered events that provide insight into modern politics and religion. New episodes every 2 weeks. Find Historical Blindness on most podcast players and platforms.
As a longtime foreign correspondent, I've worked in lots of places, but nowhere as important to the world as China. I'm Jane Perlez, former Beijing bureau chief for the New York Times. In our third season of Face Off, the US versus China, we'll explore some of the biggest issues dividing these global powers today. Trump and Xi Jinping, AI, China's growing military might, and also robots. New episodes of Face Off are available now, wherever you get your podcasts.